In this lecture, the number of considerations pertaining to the application of time bar clauses are explained. These considerations, if kept in mind while applying time bar clauses, could pay off favorable return to claimants, placing them in closer position to being awarded what they claim. They also may help assess claims more reasonably. Clause 4.21 Progress Reports. Unless otherwise stated in the particular conditions, monthly progress reports shall be prepared by the contractor and submitted to the engineer in 6 copies. The first report shall cover the period up to the end of the first calendar month following the commencement date. Reports shall be submitted monthly thereafter, each within 7 days after the last day of the period to which it relates. Clause 8.1 Commencement of works. The engineer shall give the contractor not less than 7 days' notice of the commencement date. Unless otherwise stated in the particular conditions, the commencement date shall be within 42 days after the contractor received the letter of acceptance. Clause 19.6 Optional termination, payment and release. If the execution of substantially all the works in progress is prevented for a continuous period of 84 days by reason of force majeure of which notice has been given under subclause 19, to notice of force majeure or for multiple periods which total more than 140 days due to the same notified force majeure, then either party may give to the other party the notice of termination of the contract. In this event, the termination shall take effect 7 days after the notice is given, and the contractor shall proceed in accordance with subclause 16.3 cessation of work and removal of contractor's equipment. Clause 9.1 Contractor's obligations. The contractor shall give to the engineer not less than 21 days notice of the date after which the contractor will be ready to carry out each of the tests on completion. Unless otherwise agreed completion. Unless otherwise agreed, tests on completion shall be carried out within 14 days after this date, on such day or days as the engineer shall instruct. Clause 10.1 Taking over the works and sections, the contractor may apply by notice to the engineer for a taking over certificate not earlier than 14 days before the works will, in the contractor's opinion, be complete and ready for taking over. If the works are divided into sections, the contractor may similarly apply for a taking over certificate for each section. Clause 10.3 Interference with tests on completion. If the contractor is prevented, for more than 14 days, from carrying out the tests on completion by a cause for which the employer is responsible, the employer shall be deemed to have taken over the works or section as the case may be on the date tests on completion would otherwise have been completed. The engineer shall then issue a taking over certificate accordingly, and the contractor shall carry out the tests on completion as soon as practicable, before the expiry date of the defects notification period. The engineer shall require tests on completion to be carried out by giving 14 days notice and in accordance with the relevant provisions of the contract. Clause 12.1 Procedure for tests after completion. Tests after completion shall be carried out as soon as is reasonably practicable after the works or section have been taken over by the employer. The employer shall give to the contractor 21 days notice of the date after which the tests after completion will be carried out. Unless otherwise agreed, these tests shall be carried out within 14 days after this date, on the day or days determined by the employer. Clause 15.2 Termination by employer. In any of these events or circumstances, the employer may, upon giving 14 days notice to the contractor, terminate the contract and expel the contractor from the site. In the case of subparagraph D or F, the employer may by notice terminate the contract immediately. Clause 16.2. Termination by contractor. In any of these events or circumstances, the contractor may, upon giving 14 days notice to the employer, terminate the contract. However, in the case of subparagraph F or G, the contractor may by notice terminate the contract immediately. Clause 19.2. Notice of force majeure. If a part be prevented from performing any of its obligations under the contract by force majeure, then it shall give notice to the other party of the event or circumstances constituting the force majeure and shall specify the obligations, the performance of which is or will be prevented. The notice shall be given within 14 days after the party became aware, or should have become aware, of the relevant event or circumstance constituting force majeure. Clause 4.2. Performance security. The employer shall return the performance security to the contractor within 21 days after receiving a copy of the performance certificate. Clause 4.16. Transport of goods. Transport of goods. The contractor shall give the engineer not less than 21 days notice of the date on which any plant or a major item of other goods will be delivered to the site. Clause 5.2. Contractor's documents. Unless otherwise stated in the employer's requirements, each review period shall not exceed 21 days, calculated from the date on which the engineer receives the contractor's document and the contractor's notice. This notice shall state that the contractor's document is considered ready, both for review and approval, if so specified in accordance with this subclause, and for use. The notice shall also state that the contractor's document complies with the contract, or the extent to which it does not comply. Clause 8.3. Program. Unless the engineer, within 21 days after receiving the program, to the contractor stating the extent to which it does not comply with the contract, the contractor shall proceed in accordance with the program, subject to his other obligations under the contract. The employer's personnel shall be entitled to rely upon the program when planning their activities. Clause 9.2. Delayed tests. If the tests on completion are being unduly delayed by the contractor, the engineer may by notice require the contractor to carry out the tests within 21 days after receiving the notice. The contractor shall carry out the tests on such day or days within that period as the contractor may fix and of which he shall give notice to the engineer. If the contractor fails to carry out the tests on completion within the period of 21 days, the employer's personnel may proceed with the tests at the risk and cost of the contractor. The tests on completion shall then be deemed to have been carried out in the presence of the contractor and the results of the tests shall be accepted as accurate. Clause 14.7. Payment. The first installment of the advance payment within 42 days after issuing the letter of acceptance or within 21 days after receiving the documents in accordance with subclause 4.2 performance security and subclause 14.2 advance payment, whichever is later. Clause 16.1. Contractors. Entitlement to suspend work if the engineer fails to, in accordance with subclause 14.6, issue of interim payment certificates or the employer fails to comply with subclause 2. For employer financial arrangements for subclause 14.7 payment, the contractor may, after giving not less than 21 days notice to the employer, suspend work or reduce the rate of work unless and until the contractor has received the payment certificate, reasonable evidence or payment, as the case may be and as described in the notice. Clause 9.1. Contractor's obligations. The contractor shall give to the engineer not less than 21 days notice of the date after which the contractor will be ready to carry out each of the tests on completion, unless otherwise agreed. agreed. Tests on completion shall be carried out within 14 days after this date, on such day or days as the engineer shall instruct. Clause 12.1 Procedure for tests after completion. Tests after completion shall be carried out as soon as is reasonably practicable after the works or section have been taken over by the employer. The employer shall give to the contractor 21 days notice of the date after which the tests after completion will be carried out. Unless otherwise agreed, these tests shall be carried out within 14 days after this date, on the days determined by the employer. The tests after completion shall be carried out as soon as is reasonably practicable after the works or section have been taken over by the employer. The employer shall give to the contractor 21 days notice of the date after which the tests after completion will be carried out. Unless otherwise agreed, these tests shall be carried out within 14 days after this date, on the day or days determined by the employer. Clause 1.1.3 Dates, tests, periods and completion. Base date means the date 28 days prior to the latest date for submission of the tender. Clause 1.6 Contract Agreement. Contract Agreement. The parties shall enter into a contract agreement within 28 days after the contractor receives the letter of acceptance, unless they agree otherwise. The contract agreement shall be based upon the form annexed to the particular conditions. The costs of stamp duties and similar charges, if any, imposed by law in connection with entry into the contract agreement shall be borne by the employer. Clause 2.4 Employer financial arrangements. The employer shall submit, within 28 days after receiving any request from the contractor, reasonable evidence that financial arrangements have been made and are being maintained which will enable the employer to pay the contract price as estimated at that time in accordance with Clause 14 Contract Price and Payment. If the employer intends to make any material change to his financial arrangements, the employer shall give notice to the contractor with detailed particulars. Clause 4.2 Performance Security. The contractor shall deliver the performance security to the employer within 28 days after receiving the letter of acceptance, and shall send a copy to the engineer. The performance security shall be issued by an entity and from within a country or other jurisdiction approved by the employer, and shall be in the form annexed to the particular conditions or in another form approved by the employer. The contractor shall ensure that the performance security is valid and enforceable until the contractor has executed and completed the works and remedied any defects. If the terms of the performance security specify its expiry date, and the contractor has not become entitled to receive the performance certificate by the date 28 days prior to the expiry date, the contractor shall extend the validity of the performance security until the works have been completed and any defects have been remedied. Clause 4.4 Subcontractors. The contractor shall give the engineer not less than 28 days notice of the intended date of the commencement of each subcontractor's work, and of the commencement of such work on the site. Clause 8.1 Payment for plant and materials in event of suspension. The work on plant toward delivery of plant and/or materials has been suspended for more than 28 days, and Clause 8.11 Prolonged suspension. If the suspension under subclause 8.8 suspension of work has continued for more than 84 days, the contractor may request the engineer's permission to proceed. If the engineer does not give permission within 28 days after being requested to do so, the contractor may, by giving notice to the engineer, treat the suspension as an omission under Clause 13. Variations and adjustments of the affected part of the works. If the suspension affects the whole of the works, the contractor may give notice of termination under subclause 16.2 Termination. Clause 10.1 taking over of the works and sections. The engineer shall, within 28 days after receiving the contractor's application, A. Issue the taking over certificate to the contractor, certificate to the contractor, stating the date on which the works or section were completed in accordance with the contract, except for any minor outstanding work and defects which will not substantially affect the use of the works or section for their intended purpose either until or whilst this work is completed and these defects are remedied, or B. Reject the application, giving reasons and specifying the work required to be done by the contractor to enable the taking over certificate to be issued. The contractor shall then complete this work before issuing the further notice under this subclause. If the engineer fails either to issue the taking over certificate or to reject the contractor's application within the period of 28 days, and if the works or section as the case may be are substantially in accordance with the contract, the taking over certificate shall be deemed to have been issued on the last day of that period. Clause 11.6. Further tests. If the work of remedying of any defect or damage may affect the performance of the works, the engineer may require the repetition of any of the tests described in the contract, including tests on completion and / or tests after completion. The requirement shall be made by notice within 28 days after the defect or damage is remedied. Clause 11.9. Performance certificate. The engineer shall issue the performance certificate 28 days after the latest of the expiry dates of the defects notification periods, or as soon thereafter as the contractor has supplied all the contractor's documents and completed and tested all the works, including remedying any defects. A copy of the performance certificate shall be issued to the employer. Clause 11.11 Clearance of site. If all these items have not been removed within 28 days after the employer receives a copy of the performance certificate, the employer may sell or otherwise dispose of any remaining items. The employer shall be entitled to be paid the costs incurred in connection with, or attributable to, such sale or disposal and restoring the site. Clause 14.2. Advance payment. The contractor shall ensure that the guarantee is valid and enforceable until the advance payment has been repaid, but may be progressively reduced by the amount repaid by the contractor as indicated in the payment certificates. If the terms of the guarantee specify its expiry date, and the advance payment has not been repaid by the date 28 days prior to the expiry date, the contractor shall extend the validity of the guarantee until the advance payment has been repaid. Clause 14.6. Issue of interim payment certificates. No amount will be certified or paid until the employer has received and approved the performance security. Thereafter, the engineer shall, within 28 days after receiving a statement and supporting documents, issue to the employer an interim payment certificate which shall state the amount which the engineer fairly determines to be due, with supporting particulars. Clause 14.13. Issue of final payment certificate. Within 28 days after receiving the final statement and written discharge in accordance with Clause 14.11 Application for final payment certificate and Subclause 14 Payment certificate and Subclause 14.12 Discharge. The engineer shall issue, to the employer, the final payment certificate which shall state: if the contractor has not applied for a final payment certificate in accordance with Subclause 14. 11 Application for final payment certificate and Subclause 14.12 Discharge. The engineer shall request the contractor to do so. If the contractor fails to submit an application within a period of 28 days, the engineer shall issue the final payment certificate for such amount as he fairly determines to be due. Clause 15.2. Termination by employer. To comply with a notice issued under Subclause 7.5 Rejection or Subclause 7.6 Remedial work within 28 days after receiving it. Clause 15.5 To Termination. The employer shall be entitled to terminate the contract, at any time for the employer's convenience, by giving notice of such termination to the contractor. The termination shall take effect 28 days after the later of the date on which the contractor received this notice or the employer returns the performance security. The employer shall not terminate the contract under this subclause in order to execute the works himself or to arrange for the works to be executed by another contractor. Clause 17.5 Intellectual and industrial property rights. Whenever the party does not give notice to the other party of any claim within 28 days of receiving the claim, the first party shall be deemed to have waived any right to indemnity under this subclause. Clause 20.1 Contractors' claims. If the contractor considers himself to be entitled to any extension of the time for completion or any additional payment, under any clause of these conditions or otherwise in connection with the contract, the contractor shall give notice to the engineer, describing the event or circumstance giving rise to the claim. The notice shall be given as soon as practicable, and not later than 28 days after the contractor became aware, or should have become aware, of the event or circumstance. If the contractor fails to give notice of a claim within such period of 28 days, the time for completion shall not be extended, the contractor shall not be entitled to additional payment, and the employer shall be discharged from all liability in connection with the claim. Otherwise, the following provisions of this subclause shall apply. The contractor shall send a final claim within 28 days after the end of the effects resulting from the event or circumstance, or within such other period as may be proposed by the contractor and approved by the engineer. Clause 20.2 Appointment of the Dispute Adjudication Board. Disputes shall be adjudicated by a DAB in accordance with subclause 20.4 obtaining dispute adjudication board's decision. The parties shall jointly appoint a DAB by the date 28 days after a party gives notice to the other party of its intention to refer a dispute to a DAB in accordance with subclause 20.4. Clause 20.4 Obtaining dispute adjudication board's decision. If either party is dissatisfied with the DAB's decision, then either party may, within 28 days after receiving the decision, give notice to the other party of its dissatisfaction. If the DAB to give its decision within the period of 84 days or as otherwise approved after receiving such reference or such payment, then either party may, within 28 days after this period has expired, give notice to the other party of its dissatisfaction. If the DAB has given its decision as to a matter in dispute to both parties, and no notice of dissatisfaction has been given by either party within 28 days after it received the DAB's decision, then the decision shall become. Clause 4.2 Performance security. Failure by the contractor to pay the employer an amount as either agreed by the contractor or determined under subclause 2. 5 Employer's claims or clause 20 claims. Disputes or clause 20 claims, disputes and arbitration within 42 days after this agreement toward termination. Failure by the contractor to remedy a default within 42 days after receiving the employer's notice requiring the default to be remedied. Clause 14.4 Schedule of payments. If the contract does not include a schedule of payments, the contractor shall submit non-binding estimates of the payments which he expects to become due during each quarterly period. The first estimate shall be submitted within 42 days after the commencement date. Revised estimates shall be submitted at quarterly intervals, until the taking over certificate has been issued for the works. Clause 16.2 Termination by contractor. The contractor does not receive the reasonable evidence within 42 days after notice under subclause 16.1 Contractor's entitlement to suspend work in respect of a failure to comply with subclause 2. For employer financial arrangements, the contractor does not receive the amount due under an interim payment certificate within 42 days after the expiry of the time stated in subclause 14.7 payment within which payment is to be made except for deductions in accordance with subclause 2.5 employer's claims. Clause 20.1 Contractor's claims. Within 42 days after the contract came aware or should have become aware of the event or circumstance giving rise to the claim, or within such other period as may be proposed by the contractor and approved by the engineer. The contractor shall send to the engineer a fully detailed claim which includes full supporting particulars of the basis of the claim and of the extension of time or additional payment claimed. If the event or circumstance giving rise to the claim has a continuing effect, within 42 days after receiving the claim or any further particulars supporting a previous claim, or within such other period as may be proposed by the engineer and approved by the contractor, the engineer shall respond with approval, or with disapproval and detailed comments. He may also request any necessary further particulars, but shall nevertheless give his response on the principles of the claim within such time. Clause 20.3 Failure to agree dispute adjudication board. The parties fail to agree upon the appointment of a replacement person within 42 days after the date on which the sole member or one of the three members declines to act or is unable to act as a result of death, disability, resignation or termination of appointment. Clause 8.1 Commencement of works. The engineer shall give the contractor not less than 7 days' notice of the commencement date. Unless otherwise stated in the particular conditions, the commencement date shall be within 42 days after the contractor received the letter of acceptance. Clause 14.7 Payment. The first installment of the advance payment within 42 days after issuing the letter of acceptance or within 21 days after receiving the documents in accordance with subclause. Clause 13.8 Adjustments for changes in cost. LNN are the current cost indices or reference prices for period and expressed in the relevant currency of payment, each of which is applicable to the relevant tabulated cost element on the date 49 days prior to the last day of the period to which the particular payment certificate relates. If the contractor fails to complete the works within the time for completion, adjustment of prices thereafter shall be made using either 1. Each index or price applicable on the date 49 days prior to the expiry of the time for completion of the works, or 2. The current index or price, whichever is more favorable to the employer. Clause 14.7 Payment. The amount certified in each interim payment certificate within 56 days after the engineer receives the statement and supporting documents, and the amount certified in the final payment certificate within 56 days after the employer received this payment certificate. Clause 14.11 Application for final payment certificate. Within 56 days after receiving the performance certificate, the contractor shall submit to the engineer 6 copies of a draft final statement with supporting documents showing in detail in a form approved by the engineer. Clause 16.2 Termination by contractor. The engineer fails, within 56 days after receiving a statement and supporting documents, to issue the relevant payment certificate. Clause 14.1 Statement at completion. Within 84 days after receiving the taking over certificate for the works, The contractor shall submit to the engineer 6 copies of a statement at completion with supporting documents, in accordance with subclause 14.3. Application for interim payment certificates. Clause 20.4. Obtaining dispute adjudication board's decision within 84 days after receiving such reference or the advance payment referred to in clause of Appendix. General conditions of dispute adjudication agreement, whichever date is later, or within such other period as may be proposed by the DAB and approved by both parties, the DAB shall give its decision, which shall be reasoned and shall state that it is given under this clause. Clause 19.6. Optional termination, payment and release. If the execution of substantially all the works in progress is prevented for a continuous period of 84 days by reason of force majeure of which notice has been given under subclause 19, to notice of force majeure or for multiple periods which total more than 140 days due to the same notified force majeure, then either party may give to the other party the notice of termination of the contract. In this event, the termination shall take effect 7 days after the notice is given. Contractor shall proceed in accordance with subclause 16.3 cessation of work and removal of contractor's equipment. Clause 8.11. Prolonged suspension. If the suspension under subclause 8.8 suspension of work has continued for more than 84 days, the contractor may request the engineer's permission to proceed. If the engineer does not give permission within 28 days after being requested to do so, the contractor may, by giving notice to the engineer, treat the suspension as an omission under Clause 13. Variations adjustments of the affected part of the works. If the suspension affects the whole of the works, the contractor may give notice of termination under subclause 16. To termination by contractor. Clause 19.6. Optional termination, payment and release. If the execution of substantially all the works in progress is prevented for a continuous period of 84 days by reason of force majeure of which notice has been given under subclause 19, to notice of force majeure or for multiple periods which total more than 140 days due to the same notified force majeure, then either party may give to the other party the notice of termination of the contract. In this event, the termination shall take effect 7 days after the notice is given. Shall proceed in accordance with subclause 16.3 cessation of work and removal of contractor's equipment. Clause.
If you like this video, kindly subscribe to our channel to get a notification for the next videos.